Seeing as how it's Halloween, I decided to dress up as a character that I like, unless you're watching this in the future, in which case it's not Halloween for you, and this just looks really weird. But whatever the case, we're going to be taking a look at arguably the most successful scam book ever written, known as Think and Grow Rich. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this book, it's a book where the creator, Napoleon Hill, says that he talked to Andrew Carnegie and many other great millionaire people of the early 19th century and got all their wisdom and put it in this book to give to you. And for nearly 100 years at this point, people, business people, have been recommending this book, and you've probably seen a few people on YouTube recommend it as well.
That is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill.
You probably heard of the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. And that's a great book. Everybody should read that book.
The next one we're going to go into is the one that really changed my life, Think and Grow Rich.
Now, unfortunately, the entire book, Think and Grow Rich, despite being one of the most recommended business books ever, is a complete lie. There is no evidence that Napoleon Hill ever met Andrew Carnegie or any of the other famous early 20th century figures like Henry Ford and John D Rockefeller that he claims he spoke to in the book. Think and Grow Rich has sold millions of copies since it was released in 1937 and has been the inspiration for countless other self-help books as well. The Secret and its Laws of Attraction, which was a huge hit in 2006, was based off the teachings of Think and Grow Rich, and countless businessmen over the years have claimed it's a must-read book. It really is amazing that this book, which is a complete lie written by a lifelong scammer, has become such a cherished treasure in the business world to this day. In order to tell the full story of how Think and Grow Rich is a scam, we have to tell the story of its author, Napoleon Hill. Napoleon, over the course of his life, was involved in countless scams and was wanted by the authorities multiple times across his life. He was a womanizer that was married 5 times, with documented cases of cheating on many of them, as well as allegations of physical abuse. On top of all of that, despite publishing Think and Grow Rich, and it became massively successful in his lifetime, he ended up making almost no money from the book and died a poor man. This is the man that supposedly wrote the keys to success that millions of people around the world have promoted for nearly 100 years, and the real truth behind it all is that he was a con man and generally terrible human being as well. Napoleon was born in 1883 in a one-room log cabin in Virginia to a poor family. By the age of 15, he had already married his first wife after she claimed the teenager had knocked her up, but a year later she admitted that she was lying, and he got his first divorce at 16. After attending business school, Hill relocated to Alabama, where he started his first of many documented scams. He co-founded the Acre Hill Lumber Company in 1907, which only operated for a year before it had to declare bankruptcy. Hill had been buying lumber from out of state on credit and then reselling it through his lumber mill, all the while never paying back the creditors he had originally bought from. This bankruptcy caused his second wife to divorce him and leave with their son. Napoleon, whose real first name was actually Oliver, ended up fleeing the state when authorities began looking for him and moved to Washington, D.C., which is when he began using his middle name, Napoleon, to start a new life. What's important to note that in the book Think and Grow Rich, Napoleon claims 1908 is when he first met Andrew Carnegie and was given the assignment by him to interview the business leaders of the world to tell their story of success. During the entire year of 1908 that he claimed this happened, he was actually on the run from the law after his failed lumber mill scam, which adds even more improbability about his story. Throughout the 1910s and 20s, Hill moved around the United States and operated various different scams until they would get shut down. In 1915, Hill founded the George Washington Institute of Advertising in Chicago, where he made his first attempt at teaching self-confidence classes to young men. Hill was the 1900s version of Andrew Tate, but sadly his school was shut down in 1918 after the state of Illinois issued warrants for his arrest after he violated securities laws by trying to sell shares of his school at a valuation of $100,000 despite the entire company only having $1,200 to its name. Over the years, Hill created several magazines that he distributed around the country. Many of these magazines contained advertisements for various sweepstakes or charities that weren't actually real, and in 1919 the Federal Trade Commission brought charges against Hill for his magazine, Hill's Golden Rule, claiming it used fraudulent advertising and laundered funds meant for a veterans charity into a fraudulent oil stock scheme. It was during this time that Hill was able to get an awkward picture taken of him standing next to Thomas Edison. This photo is the only evidence that Hill ever had that showed he ever met any of the important people he claimed to in his book, Think and Grow Rich. However, the story behind the photo is far different than what Hill claimed years later. Hill told Edison's team that Edison had won an award from his magazine, Hill's Golden Rules, and was able to weasel his way into a photo with him. For years, Hill used this as evidence of truth to his claims in Think and Grow Rich. However, outside this one photo, the Edison estate has no knowledge that Hill ever interviewed Edison at all. Despite all the scams Hill ran over the years, none of them made him truly rich, and it wasn't until 1928 that he was able to convince a publisher to publish his first book, The Law of Success. Now, this book was basically an early version of his later book, Think and Grow Rich. In the book, he claims Andrew Carnegie tasked him with interviewing over 100 American millionaires of the time. Hill claimed the book was based on interviews he had with Henry Ford, J.P. Morgan, Alexander Graham Bell, and many more. The book was an overnight success and was Hill's first foray into the life of luxury. Within a year, Hill had bought a Rolls-Royce and a 600-acre property in upstate New York. Hill's life of luxury was short-lived, however, because a year after his success, the Great Depression swept across the United States. Hill, like many others, lost everything. In 1930, Hill attempted to find fame again with his second book, The Magic Ladder to Success. This book, unlike his first, was a failure and pushed Hill further into debt. Eventually, Hill's third wife, Florence, left him and took what remained of their assets they had for her and the children. Throughout the 1930s, Hill began lecturing his way across the United States until 1937, when during a lecture he met a young woman named Rosa. They ended up going on a date the next day and were engaged and married within 48 hours of the first date. Rosa and Napoleon were a fantastic team, and they both played a role in creating Hill's most famous work, Think and Grow Rich. Following months of working on the book together, they were able to publish Think and Grow Rich in 1937, and it became an overnight success. Much like the first book, Grow Rich claims that Hill talked to the wealthiest men of the time and learned the secrets of success from them. Grow Rich expands on the first book and covers what Hill called the 13 Steps to Riches. This book came out near the end of the Great Depression, and it was a time where Americans were hungry for self-help motivation and positive stories. Had this book come out in the internet era, I think it would have been quickly seen as a fake, but at the time, for whatever reason, it wasn't. Hill's biographers have since claimed the book has sold over 20 million copies, which would make it one of the most successful self-help books of all time, if true, but those numbers have never been able to be backed up. Over the years, even when Napoleon was still alive, there were claims that the book was a lie, but for whatever reason it never fell out of favor and continues to sell copies to this day. When looking into the book, several things don't add up. One of the main issues with the book is Hill's claim of meeting Andrew Carnegie and being given the task in interviewing all these wealthy people. Hill didn't start making this claim until around the 1920s, claiming Carnegie gave him the task in 1908. Carnegie died in 1919, years before Hill ever made this claim, so there was no way for anyone to confirm with a dead man if this was true. An investigator named Matt Novak contacted a biographer of Andrew Carnegie named David Nassau a few years ago and asked him if he thought there was any chance Carnegie and Hill ever met, to which he replied that found no evidence of any sort of Carnegie and Hill ever met. When pressed further if he believed Hill's book had any truth to its claims of working with Carnegie, he said, "Let me put it this way, I found no evidence that the book was authentic." With all these stories of meeting these famous people taking place over 100 years ago, at this point it's hard to say with 100% certainty it never happened, since they're dead now and the internet didn't exist to catalog their daily lives. Hill's entire life of scamming people would lead me to believe this book is a scam as well. When Hill was still alive and asked for evidence to support his claim of meeting all these people, he claimed all the evidence of his interview with the millionaires was conveniently lost in a fire several years prior. If all that isn't evidence enough for you, following the success of the book, Hill did even more outlandish things and ended up associating with a cult named the Royal Fraternity of the Master Metaphysicians. This cult viewed Think and Grow Rich as a religious text and followed all its principles. The cult made claims that a special diet they created, if eaten your entire life, would allow you to become immortal. In 1939, the cult adopted a baby named Jean and attempted to raise her on this special diet to create the first immortal human. The cult's founder made Napoleon Hill the girl's godfather, but Hill distanced himself from the cult once they ran into legal trouble, and eventually its founder went to prison. On top of all of that, Hill later made claims that he was a close friend of President Woodrow Wilson while he was in office, and made the claim that he was responsible for helping President Wilson negotiate Germany's surrender at the end of World War I. He would also make the claim to be friends with President Roosevelt, and that he helped him coin the famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It's really amazing all the outlandish things this guy claimed, and I feel like if he was alive today with the modern internet, he would instantly get recognized as a scammer, but being as how he was making all these claims over half a century ago, he was able to get away with all of it. Now, what's interesting to note at the end is that despite Think and Grow Rich being an overnight success, Hill made almost no money from the book. At the time, Hill was paying child support to his third ex-wife and owed many people money, so he signed over all the rights to the book to his fourth wife at the time, Rosa. Shortly after the book's success, Rosa ended up divorcing Napoleon, and throughout the life of the book's success, she ended up making all the money off of it. Napoleon tried to take her to court over success, but since he legally signed over the rights to her, he ended up losing the case. Ultimately, Hill tried several more scams later in life, but none of them ever made him rich again, and he died in 1970 a poor man, despite writing one of the most successful self-help books ever written.